If you haven't written down questions, you can continue to do that during the questions. We'll start with Steve Ford, I believe.
Okay. Several people asked questions about the Second Amendment, the extent of the Second Amendment, so perhaps we'd want to start with Professor Weaver. And I'll synthesize it, but they're along the same line, that whatever else one might say about the text of the amendment, it mentions neither guns nor firearms. Why is it interpreted these days to allow almost absolute gun ownership rights, but allows prohibition of, say, ground-air missiles and chemical and biological agents? What's so special about guns in the bearing arms context?
The Second Amendment specifically refers to the right of the people to bear arms. So it clearly gives people some right to bear arms. Now the question is, what's the extent of that? And that's part of what's unclear. I mean, in Heller, which is one of the recent decisions, the court suggested that you might be able to ban those things that are unusual and dangerous. So I suppose we're going to draw some distinctions, but the court hasn't done much yet. I might, though, make one suggestion, which is this question of balancing. You know, we balance a lot in this country, but we don't always balance in the way that they balance in other countries. For example, when we talk about freedom of expression, we still balance freedom of expression against competing interest, but we really put a bit of a thumb on the scale in terms of free speech. So a lot of the question when we talk about the Second Amendment focuses on what's the court going to do in terms of what the standard of review is going to be. Are we going to apply rational basis, undue burden, strict scrutiny? And of course, the higher the level of scrutiny, the more likely we are to strike restrictions down. So that's going to be the interesting part of it is. But the court has signaled that it's willing to uphold some restrictions.
It's actually a very good question, because in many of the earlier court decisions and in some of the earlier statutes and constitutional provisions, the right to bear arms included knives and hatchets and all sorts of other things. But I think it's pretty clear from kind of the historical context that what the founders were dealing with was firearms, because that was an integral part of the constitution of a militia and the kind of weaponry that was necessary to actually defend against, whether it was Indian attacks or intrusions by the British government or whatever it may be. So I think it's safe to say the historical context did relate pretty much to firearms.
The problem with a question like that is it's an attempt to reduce a very crucial issue to almost an absurd level, because we're talking about, when you start talking about missiles and weapons of mass destruction and all that kind of thing, you're talking about, to begin with, crew-served weapons, the provinces of governments, mass millions and billions of dollars of development. Come on. This is not individual weaponry, and it's not an individual right. The Constitution is about, and everything that the founders talked about in those early days, individual personal rights. Now, it can be argued, if you want to take it to an extreme like that there shouldn't be any prohibition on private ownership of heavier weapons. The cannon that were going to be seized by the British at the outset of the Revolution were privately owned. There was no government ownership of firearms at that point in time, because there was basically no federal or U.S. government. So the tradition of the privateer under the letter of marque was a very strong one in that period. When you didn't have sufficient naval ships under your government's control, you hired out people to go out and carry out the policies of your nation. So, you know, you can argue back and forth about how extreme do you want to get it. The bottom line is we're talking about a principle. And the principle that they understood is, one, you have a principle to self-defense, to the preservation of your life, that's rooted in the religious beliefs of virtually every group represented in the United States at the founding of the nation. It is a strong part of the Judeo-Christian tradition. Secondly, We're talking about the right to be able to determine your own fate as a member of a group resisting tyranny. And this gets lost in a lot of the argument about the Second Amendment and what it means. If you go back and read the founders, unobscured by the later self-serving interpretations of various so-called scholars, you can see quite plainly what it meant to them. And that's what's really critical. That's what I'd urge each and every one of you to do. Don't waste your time reading the talking points from anti-gun or pro-gun groups. Go back and read what they wrote to each other about the subject, and you see how critical a personal individual right was to them.
Next question.
If we can move beyond the issue of rights, we have quite a few questions that are concerned about the specifics of any proposed gun control legislation. And the first one, Congressman Yarmuth, is directed to you, stating, this person states, according to FBI statistics, rifles, assault rifles, and shotguns account for 2.6% of U.S. murders, and assault rifles account for less than 1%. Banning assault rifles will have a tiny effect on the murder rate. Is this correct, is the question to you.
It's largely correct. I think the number is a little bit higher than that, but it's still, without question, it's a very small percentage of all the gun deaths in the country are actually with military-style weapons. The issue is, not so, in my way of thinking, not so much banning those weapons. It's to limiting the capacity of magazines. When Gabby Giffords was shot, Jared Loughner fired 31 or 33 bullets in 15 seconds. He was stopped when he was changing magazines and was wrestled to the ground. The 13th bullet of that rifle that he shot killed a 9-year-old girl. And so this is an issue of, again, balancing the, shouldn't say balancing, this is an issue for me, with forgetting the background check, of limiting the amount of carnage that can be done by a weapon when it's in society. And clearly in the Newtown situation, if the assailant had not had multiple magazines with 30 bullet capacity, there's a chance that fewer of those kids would have died. And the argument that you shouldn't do anything because you can't stop everything is, to me, a ridiculous argument. And if we could stop 5% or 10% of the 30,000 deaths, the 11 to 12,000 murders that occur every year, to me, that is worth a small limitation on the rights of responsible gun owners.
The problem in talking about magazine capacity reductions and talking about limiting the specific capacities of the tools and the implements is, again, it misses the greater question, the greater problem. As was pointed out, these individual incidents represent a very, very tiny fraction of the problems with people being killed in this country. It could be alleged that it's not a problem for a great many of you and a great many of the people at large until such time as young white children are killed. There are far more young black men being murdered in this country with handguns, not with the so-called assault weapons, every year. Yet the people who want to ban guns jump on the incidents where school children are slaughtered. Is that racism? It's a good question, something that a lot of people ask. Why do they jump on the business of these semi-automatic rifles? Because, as I said initially, it is something that people don't understand. Now, you talk about the Virginia Tech shootings. Cho, when he went into that school, was armed with a couple of handguns and magazines that were limited to 10 rounds apiece. What did Cho, who had to reload more frequently And the young man Lochner in Arizona, who wasn't caught when he was reloading, he was caught when his gun jammed because he didn't know what he was doing with it, and the individual in Connecticut have in common. They had in common that they had a free fire zone. Now, Mr. Yarmuth chose to make a comment about how fear of guns didn't stop people from buying 300 million guns. No, what it's done is it's created a situation where people say there's nothing we can do unless somebody does it for us. There is a country that is surrounded on all sides by enemies who don't just have problems with people showing up in schools and shooting at a few people or shooting in a theater. They have people who are attempting to kill them every day. That country is Israel. And in Israel, they used to have a problem with people coming into their schools and killing their children. And they put armed guards in the schools. And they armed their teachers. And they armed their principals. And they don't have that problem today. Whether people like it or not, because of their personal fear of firearms, the fact remains that nothing stops an armed individual but another armed individual. You don't protect the Congress with people standing outside the door and saying, this is a gun-free zone, we don't want you to do anything in here that's bad. You don't do it to your banks, you don't do it to your police stations. Police officers don't walk around with good thoughts, they walk around armed. Why is it then that people want to continue to insist that the best way to protect our children is to make gun-free zones? You cannot stop a maniac with good intentions. You stop a maniac with the tools to put him down. And that's common sense, not gun bans, not things that haven't worked. By the statements of the National Institute of Justice from January of this year, there has been almost zero effect on crime, no discernible effect on crime, with previous attempts at bans. Feinstein's ban of '94, which expired in 2004, did nothing to reduce crime. The federal government has made these statements. Now they want to do the same thing again. That strikes me as colossal bad sense. Let's see. We put in place a program that infringed on a lot of people. It cost us a lot of money. We didn't enforce the laws. We have fewer prosecutions of criminals now under gun laws than we had previously. It didn't work. Let's do it again because we all feel bad about children being killed. I feel bad about children being killed because there could have been somebody there to keep them safe. When the people who could have kept them safe, the men with the guns, showed up, he shot himself. What more demonstration of the power of the armed, righteous individual can there possibly be than that? When the goblins, when the horrible individuals that are willing to do this are challenged, they quit.
Next question.
Our next question has to do with support systems and mentality. There seems to be little support system for the mentally ill person in our society, and it's difficult to forcibly restrain such individuals. Is it not this part of the real problem out there? That's for everybody.
Would you like to start?
Sure. Yeah, definitely. When you come out with a program that says that we need to put people out into the communities and we need to mainstream them and get them out, and then you don't have the outpatient care, and you don't have any means by which to compel them to take their medications, and you don't have the funding for follow-on care, and you don't have a mechanism in place to put them back in a facility that doesn't exist if they get out of control, then yes, that's a recipe for disaster. I say that as a nurse with 31 years experience. I have to deal with people who are out of control that come into the emergency room, into the emergency room. What can we do about a great many of them? Very, very little. The means by which to take them off the street are cumbersome, clumsy, and difficult, and slow. And the means by which to keep them out of society so that they're kept away from the possibility of doing something awful, they're practically non-existent. The people who insisted on doing this, unfortunately, assumed that at some point in time, somebody was going to magically create the money. It doesn't happen. It's the same thing that seems to be the way government wants to work in solving our fiscal crisis. Somewhere the money's going to come from. We don't know where, but it's going to come from somewhere. So yes, there has to be more done to fund mental health support programs. And unless and until you do that, and recognize that these people cannot be allowed to be left on the street where they're making their own decisions about their medications, and the guy that's talking to them over their shoulder from next door, another dimension, is telling them, no, you don't have to take your pills, it's okay today. You know, those are the problems that you have.
Thank you. Congressman Yarmuth.
First of all, there's no question that we have an inadequate mental health care system in this country. I'm very proud that under statute and then incorporated in the Affordable Care Act, mental health care services will now be covered on the same basis that all other health issues are covered. I'm sure that Mr. Riggs and the NRA will be happy to endorse the Affordable Care Act for that purpose.
If the Affordable Care Act did what it was supposed to do and wasn't going to cost us more money and was actually as honest as you portray
Yeah, well,
it, maybe, sir,
that's
but
another
no.
hour. That's another hour debate. But there's no question that we have to do something. We have to embellish and improve our mental health care system. But what's interesting about it, with regard to gun violence, is that while Mr. LaPierre and the NRA talk about creating mental health care registries and making sure that everybody who has a health care issue is somehow identified and registered somewhere, they oppose background checks to keep the guns out of those people. So I'm not exactly sure what good it is to create a registry of people with mental health care problems if we then don't prevent them from getting firearms through a background check system.
We have several questions along the same line, which I assume are directed primarily both to Mr. Riggs and Mr. Yarmuth, about what other countries do, and the questions are along the lines that basically no other civilized democracy adopts the American policy on guns, and specifically several people mentioned Europe and Australia and Japan as having strict controls on gun ownership and much, much lower rates of murder and violent gun deaths. Isn't that an indication that, isn't that an indication that fewer guns are better?
Yes. And we're not talking about significantly lower rates of gun deaths. We're talking about a sea change of difference between, we're talking about deaths in Japan and other industrialized nations of maybe 10 or 20 a year in the entire country out of 50, 70, 100 million people, as opposed to 11 or 12,000 murders and 30,000 gun deaths here. It's not just a significant difference, it is a monumental difference.
No. All right. Look at Switzerland. Switzerland has a higher rate of gun ownership, and Swiss citizens are required to maintain in their home an actual assault rifle. Their murder rates are lower than our own. If you look at other countries where the rate of gun ownership is substantially lower, such as those in Central and South America, their murder rates are substantially higher. There has never been a demonstrated correlation between a rate of gun ownership and homicide rates. Once again, friends, do the background check and do the reading. Read Copel and Cates and others, and you'll see these things.
I have several questions from people who are concerned about what you do after the fact. It's kind of like living in Louisville. Do you put the floodgates up when the water's on Main Street? So their question is, what can we do? What can we do to deal with all the weapons that are already available in society, and how, with the number of weapons that are already in private hands, how will restrictions help curtail any future violence? And it was directed to you, Congressman Yarmuth, first. So.
Well, it obviously, to a certain extent, the horse is out of the barn on this. With 300 million guns in this country, there's not a whole lot we can do to curtail gun ownership right now. I think what we need to do is a couple things. One is, again, I think to create background checks so that people can't go out and buy guns without making sure that they don't have a criminal record, they're not guilty of domestic violence, they don't have an adjudication of a mental health issue. We have stopped since the universal background check, since the background check law went into effect with licensed gun dealers, it's far from universal. We've stopped almost 2 million people who shouldn't have guns from buying guns. It has made a difference. It's made a difference, for instance, in Colorado, where at one point, about 40% of all the guns used to commit crimes in neighboring states were coming from Colorado. Now that's dropped by, since they imposed a stricter background check law, that's dropped by 50 or 60%. So it does make a difference. Does it stop everything? Of course not. And that's what we're dealing with, a monumental problem. But again, I cannot believe that this society and the people, for instance, in this room, want to believe that in order to be safe, walking our streets, driving our streets, going to the mall, going to the movies, going to school, have to have a gun in their lunchbox or in their briefcase in order to be safe. And we can take steps and we can make a statement, particularly through the universal background check law, we can make a statement that it's not okay for everybody to have guns and that there are responsibilities that accompany the ownership of guns. And that's what we have failed to do in this country for a long time. And we've come up with the mentality that this is the Wild Wild West. You know, in Dodge City, back in the old days, they had a law in Dodge City that you couldn't bring a gun into town. You had to check your gun when it came into town. Now, didn't always work. They had a lot of gunfights in Dodge City. But they recognized the problem of people having unfettered access to guns, walking into saloons, drinking, getting into arguments, and shooting each other. They did that back then. I think we can have that same kind of sensibility now.
One quick thing to note, though, is that I don't know what the outcome of this debate will be. In other words, what restrictions we will be able to impose. One thing we know is that gun sales are way up since this debate started. Ammo sales are way up since this debate started.
The problem always goes back to how many guns do we have and how many guns do we have to take off the streets? And this is what's so disheartening. Quote the figure of 300 million guns. Now think about that, 300 million guns. If guns were the problem, the homicide rate would be quadruple what it is. It wouldn't be safe to walk down the streets. Where are those guns? Those guns are predominantly in the hands of law-abiding people. We already have a background check system in place. It already stops a great many sales. But what Mr. Yarmuth and the people who argue his side of the position don't say is that a great many of those initial denials are then subsequently approved. There are a great many people who, for some technical reason or another, don't get the gun approved in the initial check, and then it's subsequently approved by the FBI later. It is not a problem of guns, it is a problem of culture. You talked about murder rates in other countries. Japan has an extraordinarily low murder rate. Japan has a highly homogeneous population, which we do not. Look at the murder rates. Look at who is killing whom and for what reason. Most of the deaths are related to drugs, drug dealers and drug users against each other. You're talking about crime and robbery. Compare that to the hundreds of thousands of people who are out there every day using the firearms, teach their kids to shoot, using them for sport, using them for recreation. If we're talking about what is balanced, then you have to put it in that perspective. Let's get away from the obsession with guns. Now, I'm not saying that everybody has to have a gun. Mr. Yarmuth likes to typify it as we're wanting to force kids to have a gun in their lunchbox. Again, we're getting to reductio absurdum. We're talking about a serious issue here, and you want to talk about guns in lunchboxes to come up with a cute slogan. I don't care if you choose to be a victim. I don't care if you cannot defend yourself. What I care about is if you choose not to do that for yourself, don't infringe me.
A number of people has asked, does John Yarmuth have a weapon and does he also have a right to carry permit?
No, I don't have a right to carry permit, and Capitol Police, the Sergeant at Arms, and the House has advised all members not to talk about their personal security issues, so I'm not going to answer that question. And by the way, neither did Mitch, neither did Rand Paul, neither did most of the members of the delegation when asked that.
The second part of the question for all of you, and that
But
was...
by the way, my friend and colleague Gabby Gefford did own weapons.
Kitchen knives are used in many crimes and are stolen and used inappropriately. Should not the government require all knives to be registered and possibly locked up? Those carrying to the ridiculous point of weapons that are used to commit crimes. What do you guys think of that?
Well, first of all, guns aren't required to be registered, so I think there'd really be no basis for requiring other guns to be registered. But again, I will mention that in the recent poll, 65% of Kentuckians said they thought it was fine. They actually supported the idea that guns should be registered with the state of Kentucky.
Guns are registered, Mr. Yarmuth. There are a great many places in the United States where they're registered. New York City is one of those. It hasn't done much to reduce crime in New York City. Guns are absolutely banned in Chicago, which is currently running about 500 and some homicides. That hasn't done anything to stop homicides in Chicago. You know, when we're talking about the problem with registration, it's never enough. Everybody who thinks gun registration is a good idea says, oh, you people are just paranoid. You think they're coming for your guns. Well, we have good reason to believe that. Bermuda banned firearms, the personal possession of firearms, 2 decades ago. I checked headlines in Bermuda here the other day. They're having a plague of what they call gun violence in balmy Bermuda, in a place where a tourist inadvertently brought a firearm in his checked luggage and is facing a prison sentence of about 10 years and a substantial legal bill at the very least. It hasn't stopped violence in Bermuda. Gun prohibitionists always start off with, if this saves one life, it's a good thing. If this protects one child, it's a good thing. It's a reasonable start. And then when it doesn't work, as the National Institutes of Justice, an agency of the federal government, has made plain, they say, well, we need to do a little more. We need to close this loophole. We need to improve this prohibition. And when that doesn't work, let's close it up some more. And then ultimately do what New York City did when they confiscated or caused to be removed from the city all of the semi-automatic rifles that they had only 10 years before required to be registered. If you don't register them, you cannot make people get rid of them. You cannot come and take them. And that is what people don't want.
Steve, I need to respond to that. First of all, gun deaths and violence in New York City are down dramatically since and that's just a factual inaccuracy. They're down dramatically. And nobody, by the way, Charles, nobody is sponsoring legislation to register any guns. These are the false, the straw, whatever you call them. These are the things that you all throw out there to get people afraid when nobody's actually proposing them.
Mr. Yarmuth, it has happened. It happened in New York City. I just quoted it. I just told you about it. I cited historical examples.
But gun violence,
the people
but
who
you said gun
espouse
violence
those
in New York
controls
is up and it's
are
down.
calling
It's
for
significantly down.
confiscation. It cannot work without confiscation. Have you read this? Have you bothered to read what the National Institutes of Justice put out in January?
Is that the one that said that actually the assault weapons ban reduced crimes using assault weapons by 7%?
So you're here to debate this tonight, and you haven't even acquainted yourself with one of the seminal documents most recently.
2 audience members with an apparent point of view asked questions. There's one for both Mr. Riggs and Mr. Yarmuth. In Mr. Riggs' case, would you at least support closing the gun show loophole that allows guns to change hands without background checks?
The gun show loophole is largely a myth. The business, about 40% of the guns being sold are being sold without background checks. If you go to a gun show and you buy from a licensed dealer, you must do the National Criminal Instant Check System exactly as you would if you were standing in his storefront. There is no exemption or exception. What we're talking about when we're talking about not requiring background checks is if I turn to this gentleman and offer him a gun for sale, and he buys it from me as a private individual, there is no background check required. There is good judgment on my part to look at him and say, this looks like a sober and responsible individual. I can sell him this gun with a fair degree of confidence. We have done that in this country for centuries. Criminals do not go to gun shows, by and large, to get their guns. They do straw man purchases, and they steal them. And where does that information come? From the Bureau of Alcohol, Tobacco, and Firearms, from the federal government. So the people who are preaching about the gun show loophole are relying on specious and incorrect data from anti-gun proponents.
39% of the guns, of the crimes committed with guns in Connecticut were committed with guns bought illegally, well, not bought legally at gun shows, mostly in Virginia. And if you ask the mayors of Baltimore, Philadelphia, all up and down the East Coast, you will know that that is a major trafficking area. People go to Virginia, buy guns at gun shows without background checks, and take them up the East Coast and sell them. It is a major source of commerce. 40% of all gun purchases in the United States are not subjected to background checks. It's not just gun show loopholes. Online purchases are not regulated. The Aurora shooter bought his weapons and his ammunition online without a background check. This is a major source of, it's a loophole that is a lot bigger than the gun show loophole. And again, whether you think that it would be effective or not, 92% of the American people in the most recent poll support universal background checks. 74% of NRA members do it. They support it. It is what almost all responsible gun owners want to see happen because they want to make sure that guns only end up in the hands of responsible owners. It is common sense. We already have the system in place. It needs some improvement, but we need to make it universal.
Okay, and the point of view question that was directed to Congressman Yarmuth is, what do you think of Benjamin Franklin's premise that, quote, those who would trade essential liberty for a little temporary safety deserve neither?
I don't think in the context of this discussion we are talking about anyone surrendering essential liberties. No one who is potentially a lawful owner of a gun will be restricted from owning the gun of their choice. And any of the things, well, if the assault weapons ban were to be passed, which it's not going to be, but under a background check, under restrictions on magazine capacity, no responsible gun owner would be denied the right. So they're not surrendering anything.
We keep going back to this business of the magazine capacity ban and the registration, and we're going to cut this and we're going to do that. And we did these things before. You know, this is one of the frustrating things about dealing with this. We had that in place for 10 years. It didn't reduce crime. Let's talk about the gun show loophole. Here's the 40% number that everybody likes. According to the study from the federal government, that 40% number includes 29% of gun owners who said they got their guns from family members or friends and acquaintances and didn't break the law with them. 11% of firearms obtained through unfamiliar people. 3% they reported they got them through the mail, which requires a background check. You can't just buy a gun over the internet. And 4% said they made their purchase at a gun show. Now those are the facts. That's not an inflammatory 40% figure thrown out like the assault weapon terminology to scare people. We're trying to talk about facts, not the specious 40%. When you dig into the numbers and you look at it to make a rational decision, this is what you find.
This person says, I can't drive a car unless I have a license, but I can buy and use a gun today. Should we in the United States have requirements for training and certification prior to the use of guns? So we want to move it to the next level about certification and training.
I think it's a great idea for everybody to get training. Owning a gun doesn't make you a shooter any more than owning a piano makes you a musician. I think that everybody should have one if they choose to. And I think that if they choose to, they should darn well go out and get better trained with it so that they're capable. And if that dire moment comes when they need to use it for self-defense, they're capable of doing it properly. But if they choose simply to have it to plink cans with, to teach their children how to shoot, great. But making it mandatory, where's the problem with that? It's a right. You do not have a right to operate a vehicle. You do not have a right to travel on public roads that are paid for with public money in any vehicle you choose because of the regulations that are on it. But the right to defend your life is basic, primal, and eternal. You would go all the way back to the foundation of our religions and look at what the Jewish religion says about it. If a man comes to murder you, rise up and strike him down. That says you not only have a right to defend yourself, you have an obligation to defend what you have been granted by God. Given that we're talking about a primal right, you cannot put arbitrary restrictions on it, particularly when those restrictions are usually driven by an attempt to continue to infringe and deny that right. That was one of the findings that was so critical in the Heller decision from the Supreme Court. They found that the law was mostly motivated by the attempt or the intent to deny a right, and that's why they struck down D.C.'s law.
Professor Weaver, I wonder if you think that the court would permit a requirement that all gun owners have training.
You know, I don't know. The court has certainly indicated that it will uphold restrictions on gun rights. And when we see it, they can put restrictions on the idea that mentally ill people cannot possess weapons, that felons, convicted felons, cannot possess weapons. So it's indicated, even in Heller, that it would uphold certain types of restrictions. This idea of training, I don't know. Because one of the concerns they had originally was the idea that with government coming to take people's weapons. And I don't know if the court's going to give that credence or not give it credence, but I guess the concern would be if we require training, then, we're going to have a much better sense of who has what. And I don't know. My guess is the court would uphold it. I don't know.
Well, I agree with Professor Weaver's characterization of the Heller decision. It basically said that there are many restrictions that would be fully appropriate and constitutional if implemented. That basically what Heller said was that you cannot restrict the use of or the possession of what would be considered normal weapons at the time the Second Amendment was written, so basically pistols and rifles, that you can't restrict their use in the home or their possession in the home. And in D.C., which was the case that arose out of the D.C. law said you have to have your gun has to be in your home. It cannot be loaded and it has to be locked and secured. And the court also found that basically that provision makes it impractical for you to defend yourself in an emergency situation. So their decision was pretty much isolated to the use of the guns in the home for self-defense. And Scalia said in the majority opinion, basically that virtually any restriction outside of that, whether related to how the transaction for the gun is made, talking about the sale of the gun in commerce, or any restrictions on those kind of transactions, and restrictions or even bans on military-style weapons would be perfectly appropriate under the Second Amendment. So again, it was a very limited decision, and I guess I would agree with Russ that there's probably a lot more law to be made in this area as we move forward.
On behalf of the entire Louisville Forum, we thank you, all three of you all, for being with us tonight. Have a great evening, and thanks a lot for coming.